So, without further ado, welcome to this final session, Industry Leaders Question Time, where we're going to look at the challenges and issues facing our industry from the perspectives of a variety of stakeholders. Our plan is to follow BBC's Question Time format. So for those of you who are not familiar with Question Time, because I know we have an international audience here, it's a flagship BBC current affairs programme. It's held typically weekly. A panel of politicians from across the political spectrum are invited on, and they face questions from a studio audience. The kind of USP of the programme is that the panellists do not get to see the questions in advance. The audience are asked for their questions as they file into the show before the show kicks off, and then the organisers will pick interesting questions to stimulate and provoke discussion. So that's the format we are imitating here. We've made a few changes. Number one, we don't have politicians. We instead have some eminent stakeholders from across our industry whom I will introduce shortly. And secondly, instead of current affairs of the week, we want to focus on the challenges and issues facing the scholarly publishing industry as we look ahead. But beyond that, we have got some questions pre-selected. I know there's some people ready to go to ask them, and they have been chosen to stimulate discussion and debate between our panel. I think that's it. We're due to run to we're due to run to midday. If you do think of questions as we go, please make a mental note, and depending on how the timing goes, if I can take some ad hoc questions, I will. We'll just have to see how timings run with us. So, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our panel in true Question Time style. I need to go around the table. So, on my far right, Stephen Inchcombe's early publishing career was in financial publishing. He was UK publisher for the Financial Times and led EFT.com. Stephen moved into scholarly publishing about 17 years ago or so, and his roles have included being chief executive of Nature Publishing Group, chief publishing officer at Springer Nature after Springer's acquisition or merger with Macmillan, and Stephen is currently president research at Springer Nature. Chris Banks, on my immediate right, has spent her career as a librarian. She was at the British Library for over 20 years in a variety of curatorial, management and strategic roles. She has extensive experience at library director level in higher education and joined Imperial College London 10 years ago, almost exactly, where she is Director of Library Services. She's also a member of a number of working groups, including JISC's Universities UK Content Negotiation Strategy Group, and chairs the JISC Universities UK Content Expert Group. So Chris is representing our librarian stakeholders. On my immediate left, I'd like to welcome David Sweeney. His career has been in university leadership. During his 10 years as Director for Research Innovation Skills in the Higher Education Funding Council of England, HEFCE, David was instrumental in developing the UK's REF, Research Excellence Framework, which remains key in deciding what type of research is rewarded and funded in UK universities. David then served as 5 years as Executive Chair of HEFCE's successor Research England. He's still actively involved in Coalition S, and is now Professor of Research Policy at the University of Birmingham. And I know David has been an advocate against promoting broader measures of impact in research assessment, and in particular has advocated against the rising use of bibliometrics. So that reaches right back to our opening keynote speech at the start of the conference. And then finally, on my far left, during her post, Doc Fiona Hutton co-signed one of the original open letters to publishers that advocated open access. That was back in the early noughties, and she's advocated for open access throughout her career. Fiona's held editorial roles at Elsevier, then at Wiley. She was head of STM Open Access Publishing and executive publisher at Cambridge University Press, and is now head of publishing at eLife, and leads its 4 publishing departments. eLife, as I'm sure you know, was set up by funders to disrupt conventional publishing, and most recently hit the headlines as it moved away from a sort of binary accept-reject notion of publishing to a more publish-then-review model that is embracing preprints and public reviews. So, ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome our illustrious panel. My name's Dan Pollock. My role is as chair. I'm going to be more David Dimbleby than Fiona Bruce. If that resonates with people, you'll be glad to know. But my role is to take questions, direct them to each of the panelists in turn. I hope we can have an interesting discussion and debate, or maybe agreement. You never know. So that's why we went for the horseshoe setup of the tables. So, with introductions out of the way, I would like to take our first question, please, from Phil Garner. Phil.
Rightly or wrongly, impact factors are widely used to judge the quality of research. Is it right that one for-profit company has a monopoly over this?
Thank you, Phil. I think that gets us strongly out of the gate. David, if I might start with you, please.
Wow. So in the sphere in which I move, research policy, research assessment, government, that's a question that hasn't been asked for years because there's been a settled answer. And I'm sure Lizzie referred to that in the course of her opening talk. We believe that the quality of a paper is best assessed by the content rather than the place in which it emerges for publication. And I think we've moved from a lack of interest in research assessment and research policy to impact factors to a position where we regard them as positively against the kind of culture shift that needs to happen in research, where we better support our people. So the framing of your question, research impact factors that are influential in assessment, I would say is a question from 10 years ago rather than where we are today. It may be, of course, that in the business sphere, you may want to assess how you're going on the basis of that, but in the sphere in which I move, we've just gone past that into other things.
Do you see it still happening? Because I'm thinking about this. There's a recent report from Emerald Publishing that's suggesting that researchers are increasingly using impact metrics as a way of assessing quality, I mean, rightly or wrongly. And indeed, we've seen the number of journals with impact factors increase this year.
I can see the benefit there is to the sector in having a nice, simple way of measuring performance. The fact that it's probably a delusion is a problem for you rather than a problem for anyone else. And if indeed you find it valuable, that's very much your thing. I think authors, there's 70,000 authors as represented by the Research Excellence Framework in the UK. Their understanding of the research system and their commitment to the way the research system works is varied. And I understand that, as we have with the rest of research culture, a big issue in explaining what the problems are and in addressing them, because nobody likes the light being shone on themselves. So I don't doubt that people will use it, but I do think that for example, in the university discussions at senior level on how you assess things, it's getting close to forbidden to use research impact as a number, because it's bad practice. And in Koara and Lizzie Gadd's work is really all about that. I'm not actually against metrics of all kinds, because I did fund the first Metric Tide report, and I think it's essential that we understand the strength and weaknesses of different measures. But journal impact factors, to me, personally, are close to evil. But I can, in my sphere, I can understand others having different views.
Thank you. Stephen.
I think from a UK perspective, David clearly knows what he's talking about. Globally, there's much more diversity in how research assessment has so far matured. You know, the UK's ref doesn't really have direct comparisons in most other countries, perhaps Australia being the exception. So at least in our experience, it's still far too widely used for the wrong purpose. It was never set out as a researcher assessment mechanism, but it was used for a period in that way, and still in some parts of the world is still being used like that. Would like to see a more systematic approach and I don't think the REF is perfect, but it's an awful lot better than what you see elsewhere, a more systematic approach to actually assessing researchers and their work, not where their work happens to be distributed. I think a lot of the things we all deal with, transition to open access, move to open science and so on, are held up because the assessment mechanisms don't recognise and reward well enough the transitions that people say that they're committed to, but then the assessment mechanisms don't support that. And I think that's the biggest challenge. The metrics can always be designed once you're clear on your goals, but you've got to commit to those goals and then put the other elements of the system. And I just think research assessment is critical. I don't know what I missed the keynote on the first day, but if that was about hope that was a call to action to actually address that.
Yeah. Chris.
So I would agree with everything that David said. I think the chat and also with what Stephen said in terms of the situation here in the UK. I think yes, I think there is a widespread acknowledgement that the quality of the individual piece of work is not measured by the quality of the container, and indeed the measuring of the quality of the container has been shown to be extremely flawed. Nonetheless, researchers are time poor. They want proxies for where they should be reading. They want proxies for how they should evaluate. And we still have a way to go to work with them on those alternative measures. I think the REF is a very considered approach in that regard. But some researchers do still, they look abroad. They look at how assessment measures are undertaken abroad. And so they are swayed because obviously we have many international collaborations and many international authors. So moving away wholesale from impact factors is an ongoing process.
Okay, hold that thought about stakeholders coming together. I think we've got something on that, but just finally on the impact factors, Fiona.
I mean, it's a metric, but it's how it's used which is the problem. It's how it's embedded in research culture. It's how it inhibits innovation in publishing, because people are so driven by that factor that actually, they could be doing all sorts of interesting things in publishing that helps the scientific process, but that's not happening because of this particular metric. Now, obviously, there's organisations like eLife who are, have stated from the very start that they don't agree that this metric exists, that this metric is useful, and are trying to push against those particular doors. But the whole research culture needs to change in order to incorporate different models and different systems. And I think that's the real challenge. That if you try and change the system, that everything is pushing against that. And so we do need more reform in research assessment. But I think that's starting to happen. But of course, it's geographically, different in different regions, and I think that's problematic, because what works in the UK, in Europe, in the US is not necessarily the same thing that's taking hold elsewhere.
Yeah, I think I believe there's some problems with the microphone. I think they'll be fixed. Just thinking that international view, because I think your points are well made, that countries can't exist in isolation. Everybody seems in agreement that we need something different, and yet it seems to be getting more and more entrenched and stickier, in the sense that if researchers are continuing to use it. We're all well aware of the recent delisting of a bunch of journals. We're aware that there are now more journals with impact factors, significantly more journals this year than there have been before. So it seems the response to let's have fewer impact factors is to have more impact factors. I wonder if you've got thoughts on how we might make this international collaboration of stakeholders work to address that? Or is it almost happening by default, whilst everybody tries to figure out the best policy?
So I think if where there's a perception that your research quality is measured purely on the volume and where you've published, rather than recognising that, as is being done, particularly in the UK, the much broader research culture base. I think that's where that's where the focus now needs to be. I mean, we were talking just before the start about this focus in on open access rather than on the much broader and, to be honest, much more difficult open research practices. And it's that focus on research practices, it's that focus on research culture, it's that focus on all the contributors to the research endeavour, not just the top author on the paper in Journal X.
I mean, I think I'd say that if impact factors are bad, and obviously not my cup of tea, there are many other aspects of the research system that need fixed. Lizzie was talking, I assume, about Quara, where she's on the steering group, and that's got members from across Europe, and there's a similar initiative happening in the States. I think we've got to embed our future view of research in a broad possible discussion, and Fiona, you've just mentioned some of the things. I think picking off one particular aspect is unattractive. And one thing I think I'd say is that for an industry that's been very successful and very important, as mentioned at the awards last night, but sometimes an industry that treasures the way that you've got to where you are today and not always looking at how things might be tomorrow. I'd encourage you all to engage with the likes of Quara and think through what will be the opportunities for you, because I think there are substantial opportunities associated with disseminating research, to build a position for the future rather than worrying about either attacking or defending actually the past. I do think if you're trumpeting, it's great that more places are adopting impact factors. Maybe there's some sand, and maybe your head has found some of it, but you've got to decide that for yourself.
Okay. Further thoughts?
I think, in order for people to sort of move on, they have to have solutions and options about what to do instead. So, you can see that in open access transition, for example, in transformative agreements, communities that 5-6 years ago were determined not to sort of move to open access, when they had a solution of doing it through a transformative agreement, they all jumped. And I'm thinking of humanities and social sciences, for instance. And so often the whole market has to say, well, look, here are alternatives, and this is what you can do. But until that point, then people are just so stuck in the system that they know, and the one that they've been they've had since they've been a PhD student or whatever. I know when I was a PhD student, there was some students that came into the lab. They came in to a cancer research institute. Excited to make a huge difference, and then after 3 months just started obsessing about journals and impact factors and not about the science itself, and that's a fundamental problem with the whole thing.
Thank you. I'd like to take our next question then, please, from Stephanie Feldman.
Thank you. Okay, I have the funder question. So obviously the last couple of years, our industry, we have seen a lot of announcements from Coalition S, last year from OSTP. However, at the same time, the Transformative Journals program by Coalition S was announced that that's going to be cancelled. And also OSTP seems, the Nelson memo, seems to be increasingly under fire. So what is the impact of these policy announcements and statements? What does the panel feel?
Fiona.
I think, obviously, some of the funder, when they have, kind of it's carrot or stick, when they've put this sort of stick on it, actually the whole culture kind of changes because they're trying to kind of catch up with that. And when there's changes in what's going on in the funder policies, everybody kind of takes a step back and starts to think, well, actually, what do I need to do next? And that causes, confusion amongst the community about which direction that they want to head in next. I think, we need to see more statements coming from funders, because I don't think the research culture, the community, the publications would change unless there was these mandates in place. So I'm filled with hope that actually that it'll move us further forward, and we'll continue to progress down that open science route. But there's all sorts of players and changes in government and changes in who heads up particular organisations does have an effect in the long run. But my hope is that we're progressing down a path and it's inevitable now.
David?
Well, actually, I don't entirely agree with that, but I'll come to that. First of all, Coalition S was built on one of the principles being that funders shouldn't contribute to the costs of hybrid publication. Simple as that. And I think that has basically worked as a tool. The hybrid option, which was always intended to be time limited, that's clear in our documentation, I now say our, in connection with Coalition S, was a way of helping to encourage the sector into transitioning. And in some cases it's worked, but on the whole it hasn't been enormous success, which is why pursue something that's not been an enormous success. So I think this is just all part of the open access transition, which taking account of it's certainly in Europe of what's happened with a mix of green and transformative agreements has been pretty successful in my view, and we should just let it happen in natural ways. For funders though, I think it's essential that funders use the power which they have as part of their constitution. I think we need to take a much more formal view of the system than the rhetoric that different parties use, and funders have used rhetoric, I've used it, so I accept that. The reality is that funders have no power at all over publishers. We don't pay money to publishers, we have no regulatory role at all. What we do have is a power only with our grantees. So saying to our grantees that it's a condition of accepting your grant that you publish this open access is clearly legitimate, both legally and by custom and practice. I'm not a great believer in funders engaging in activity which goes beyond their powers. And it's not clear to me that there is now powers that funders can actively use. I don't believe that we have any power over business models, and we should prefer one business model over another, although supporting different business models, as with the current interest endowment, is entirely legitimate. I'm not personally convinced there's a power that allows you to differentiate on that, nor funders in particular geographies having powers that relate to authors who are not their grantees. So although I may have views, and my views are probably quite similar to yours, Fiona, in how I'd see things go, I think each actor with agency in the scholarly publishing process, and universities clearly have substantial agency and authors have substantial agency, have to take responsibility for their role in the transition according to the powers that they have. Authors have the power to choose, generally, where they publish. Their employer, as a university, doesn't generally constrain that, and it would require discussions in the employment sphere before that could happen. Universities are the customer, and they have the power that every customer has of not buying the product. Thus far, they have used that selectively and temporarily, but in the end, come to an agreement. So I think those are the elements that should lead to future change. Authors, who of course are not all of one mind, but nevertheless they have to find their place in the scholarly process. Funders, where they have powers, and universities who are, after all, spending the money.
Thank you. So if I may turn to the person with the power as the librarian university representative, I mean, how does that resonate with you, Chris?
So first of all, I think I absolutely welcome the fact that the funders are now aligning around a single set of principles, which is essentially open access at the point of publication and via whatever route is available to them, so via version of record or via deposit of author accepted manuscript. That is a huge step forward, because up until that point, and I have written about this and I have called it the policy stack, up until that point we had a really, really messy world where, depending on your funder might set embargo periods, and depending on your journal publisher or on your journal, your journal may or may not have met your funder requirements. And there was a gruesome 25-step workflow to work out whether or not you were compliant with your funder, which is pretty horrific after you've done all the work to get the research funding in and do all of the research and get it ready for publication. So this alignment around that single set of principles is incredibly useful, because it enables us to move forwards. What it's also allowed us to do, so we at universities, one of the other things again that I've been working on now for well over 8 years is identifying that the challenge with meeting those funder obligations has often been around the fact that universities generally waive copyright in favour of the author. So that's a waiver that, so in UK law, copyright usually rests with the employer. But the challenge we have had is that universities have typically waived that right, and then authors have typically then been forced, if they wish to publish, they immediately sign away those rights. So you have that point where you've given them something and then they've immediately given it to somebody else, which then makes complying with their funder policies and meeting their funder obligations challenging. So one of the things that we've been working on is an institutional rights retention policy, and that is now rolling out very much in the UK. We've got upwards of 20 institutions, and a number, including my own institution, will be rolling out soon. So what that enables us to do is be sure that we can meet our funder requirements either through working on affordable, transformative, or read and publish, because then I don't think we're genuinely transforming at the moment, but read and publish deals for our authors, which means that they can publish version of record, but in the event that we're not able to reach an affordable or a sustainable deal, that we can meet our funder requirements through legally through author deposit of the author accepted manuscript.
Before I move to Stephen, I just interested, David, on sort of your thoughts. We're talking about funders, the alignment of funders. How does that resonate?
Well, I think collaboration between funders has exactly the benefits that Chris says, and of course welcome in UKRI. We've always been close, although I'm not now involved in UKRI, so I'm not speaking in any sense for them. I think once you go broader than that, everybody is very conscious of the national pressures they're under. So it's easier to deal with things that are at national level than things that are international. I would say this, wouldn't I? I think it's a massive achievement of Coalition S to get so many different funders to align, and even where countries have not joined formally, as in Germany and the US, the policies are very similar. I also despair of people who insist on a perfect solution and every little detail being the same. The principle is they want material free to use and reuse at the point of publication, as Chris says. And in international diplomacy, which as part of Coalition S I saw at very close quarters, arguing over words at a very fine level is unfortunately necessary, particularly if you're dealing with the Commission, but it doesn't actually forward the cause of mankind greatly. So Chris is right. It's something that funders, I think, in the UK have listened to. There's been lots of discussions between funders together to try and align. But I think perfection is not always achievable.
I will let the not arguing over words resonate with the editors in the audience. But in the meantime, Stephen, what's your take on this?
I think Plan S deserves a lot of credit for creating momentum and clarity around what open access can mean, primarily through its actions in Europe and its influence outside of Europe. But the ingredients were already there, and so they were able to put a spotlight on them and provide momentum and encouragement. At the end of the day, a little bit like our discussion on research assessment, you've got to be clear on the problem, but you've also got to provide the solutions. And we've now got the tools for the job, largely. They are not perfect. The equity problem has to be solved if APCs are to be the long-term solution. But I would say we need to continue the effort to make sure that we provide the clarity and the outcomes for everybody on both the demand side and the supply side. The supply side, funders can say, well, we're focused on our country. Institutions can say we're focused on our researchers. As publishers, we have to operate across all countries and all the disciplines that we choose to operate journals in. And we don't often talk about it, but also, monographs books are moving into the open access world, at least in the UK, much faster than anywhere else. There is actually a policy on this here that's coming down the pipe now to actually be implementable, and there isn't in most of the rest of the world. They're still struggling with open access in the journal world. So I would really hope that the funders will keep talking to each other and keep aligning. I don't, like David, think there's no point trying to deal with detail if you haven't got the big picture alignment. And as great as Europe are now with the Nelson Memo and the changes in North America, and as big, significant as they are, that's still quite a lot less than 50% of the article market. There's still a long way to go, and we've been on the journey for 23 years. If we're not careful, it's going to be another 23 years before the other 50% moves across, and that's just too long. And as publishers, we have to operate all models until the point where everybody's settled on what the solution is. To me, and I've probably been, and I've repeated this many times, gold open access with APCs and transformative agreements at the institutional level are the two things driving change at the moment. Let's modify them and make them work for all purposes, rather than let's start again and try and come up and invent a whole new system all over again, because we'll spend the rest of our professional lives just in transition and never getting there. And the whole point of open access, as Chris was saying, was earlier, was open science, open research, and that's where the biggest benefits are, and that's where I think what I would say was welcome about the Nelson Memo was it actually put clarity around open data, but almost all the attention's gone on open access. We have to solve open data alongside of it, not wait until open access is done before we move on to it, because that was the point of it in the first place.
And I think actually if you just do a word count of the Nelson Memo between the publishing bit and the data bit, there's actually more of the language focusing on the data than the publishing, because in this world it's...
Yeah, but the attention by everybody else has been much more on the open access side, and when you do get into discussions about the data, in my experience, more than half the time, within 10 minutes of the start of that conversation, you're back to open access. It's just become the stumbling block that prevents open data and wider open science techniques really being used. So I think the Nelson Memo was right to raise it, but we need to then follow on it rather than just say, well, it's there now, it will happen. It will not happen unless people put serious effort into it.
I think Actually, one of the questions we had was, should we ban discussion about open access and talk instead about open science? Thoughts?
I'd rather call it open research.
I think that's where we're moving to. I think everything that publishers are doing are thinking about integrating that into the manuscript rightly. So yes, I think that the conversation has moved on.
I'm not quite in that position for the reason that Stephen said. What Coalition S did was package together a set of stuff that had been developed over the years but not presented in coherent fashion in a way that people could sign up to and implement. It made it implementable, albeit with some pain for some. I don't think we're in that position with, well, first of all, open science generally is a concept. Open data very much depends on the sphere in which you're working with the data, and in many areas the tools are just not there. So I think it's important that we do push through. As Stephen just said, we don't want to take another 23 years. I think we could take a good proportion of that time actually before it's straightforward, but perhaps there'll be more of a tipping point than there has already been. I think we've got to work a lot harder on the infrastructure and on the opportunities for open data. And to me, talking a lot about it now without actually focusing that talk on what you do to deliver it is a bit of a waste of time. So I would channel the open data discussion into a more delivery-focused approach, which probably means splitting it down. Your particle physics data is entirely different from your biological sciences data. The issues are much different, and health data particularly. So yes and no, I think, to that.
Well, I think there's been a lot of conversation at this conference about open science indicators and what to measure and how to do that. And I see that actually there's a lot of work that's going on that are trying to, not necessarily standardise approach, but look at it from an institutional point of view. To work collaboratively with others to figure out what are the best things to measure. So I think that actually that work has been done, as shown by many people in this room over the last few days. So I think whilst it's not necessarily integrated into what everybody's doing at the moment, that's coming, and it's coming very quickly.
I think if we, trying to build on these points, practical steps that actually help people start to dip their toes in the water on open research techniques. Examples, data availability statements. Everybody's talked about them. It is hard to see them being comprehensively used, and where they are used, not having the majority of authors opting for the lowest level of, yes, I may put a statement in, but it's basically contact me if you want access to this data. We need to take practical steps to make it as easy as possible for all the participants in the system to be able to start to share information and integrate it within the current setup, rather than it being a whole new setup, because it's a lot easier to add 5% more on something that exists than start from scratch all over again. That's obvious, but there's not many incentives at the minute. When you talk to people, they're so busy on grappling with all the other changes. But I don't think we can't rely on that excuse. We've got to take some leadership here ourselves, and we are also joined up globally in a way in which it's harder for many of the other agencies involved. So can't complain about it, but then not take act on it.
And I think we're beginning to touch on changing culture, changing behaviour. So at this point, Rob Johnson, I'd like to take our next question. Rob, I think, sitting over there. Can we get a microphone to Rob, please?
Thank you. So my question is, what do you understand by the term research culture, and what does a good culture look like?
Any volunteers to go first on that one?
Well, I'm happy to start. I think as good a place to go as any is the material that UKRI have published on research culture, which sets out a whole range of issues. Wellcome have obviously published a lot, and Lizzie Gadd and the Clara Group are taking all that forward. I think it is a very broad topic, and again, there's the question of what is tractable and what is not tractable. Very much the question of what can be measured so that you know whether it's you're achieving success or not, whether indeed you're on a linear or non-linear scale, whether there's an optimal value as opposed to up is good and down is bad, or vice versa. I think there's an enormously complicated set of discussions to have, which is why I think it's important that we're now focusing on groups committed to that. There's an immediate problem in the UK because, in my view, wholly correctly, research assessment is taking a greater view of the culture that leads to outputs of different kinds, actually, which are excellent, than it did before. But that does lead very sharply to the question, because research assessment in the ref has to be quite quantitative at the end of the exercise. And I think if you read Jessica Corner's Wonk HE piece from either yesterday morning or the morning before, I can't remember when it was, it sets out the need for broader sector-wide discussions, answering exactly Rob's question. So I think there are some elements where progress has been made, straightforwardly on research integrity, though there have been slow progress in the UK. I think there's much better acceptance at senior university level of the nature of some of the problems, but equally the workforce conflict there's been in universities has made some of the routes to solve that more difficult in terms of things like precarious careers, and the general squeeze in terms of funding, at least per capita, in the research system is definitely a problem that challenges some of the more positive views that people have about culture. I think 23 years, arguably longer even, on open access, I think there's a similar length of journey on culture, but we need to look at things that we can do constructively to demonstrate progress sooner than was perhaps possible in open access, although lots of stuff did happen, and Eli's been around for a long time. So, difficult task. Again, my encouragement to the people in this room is to do what you've just done by having Lizzie Gadd around. Engage with the exercise, engage critically, and think what you can do to participate in solving the problem.
Stephen?
I don't think I certainly can't give a comprehensive answer to it. I think what I'd highlight is more what's some of the changes that need to be addressed. The competition aspects, and the limited resources. There's always limited resources. It always seems to get tighter, no matter which field you look at, and research is no different. But those factors do seem to have created, from what we can see, more either accidental, intentional, or downright fraudulent activities and here I'm talking globally, not just, I'm certainly not talking about UK researchers, I don't know, we don't even look at it quite like that. But those practices, the pressure on research integrity, which we see as publishers through content, but actually is a consequence of the pressures on researchers and the research culture, is getting more and more difficult. And whatever mechanism is used to distribute research, it has to be trusted and reliable for the purposes of them building on it. And if the integrity of the system breaks down because the research culture is under such pressure that happens, then the whole thing can become a house of cards. So I don't want to be alarmist, but I think you have to address the cultural issues up front. And we have at least cases where, quite a lot of cases where we point out the practices are not right. The institutions themselves then need to step in and take responsibility for their researchers and address it. We can highlight it. We're not the police. We're not the authorities. We don't employ them. We can point it out. And there's not enough today, I'm afraid to say, there's not enough attention and determination being applied to that in many different countries of the world. So I think that's a systemic problem that has to be addressed globally as a research culture problem. And until we do, we'll keep dealing with the symptoms of it, and the tools that are out there help people to try and game the system or overcome it. And those tools are getting better. So unless we take away the motivation, we're going to be in a more and more difficult place.
Chris?
So Stephen has highlighted some of the core contributors to a less than ideal research culture, and those come down to time and time pressures, but also and acutely that certainly in the UK, no research is fully funded. At best, we get some contribution towards full economic costing. Many funders will not fund full economic costing at all, and the brutal reality is that it is fees from international students that are actually supporting a huge amount of UK research. But from the researcher's perspective, therefore, there is that constant pressure to bring in the funding, as much funding as they can, to support their research, and then to get that research done and written up as quickly as possible. And you can understand that in some of those circumstances, the temptation for corner cutting, the temptation for not taking the time to seek those diverse views and diverse inputs into the research endeavour. And so addressing research culture is something that needs to be done on very, very many levels. There's not a single fix. There's not a single intervention, and creating a culture where voices can be heard, creating a culture where there is mutual understanding of those pressures, and creating a supportive culture for all of those engaged in the research endeavour are all things that need to be addressed. And also, and this sort of goes back to a little bit to the point about data sharing earlier, it's well recognised that actually to prepare your data to be shareable for others to use is actually in and of itself an incredibly time-consuming activity. And it's then a case of looking at the examples of, okay, I have spent those 6 months doing the extra work to make my data available, but how does that then save time for others down the line? So looking at the real benefits of taking that time now and allowing and legitimizing taking that time to do that detailed work, and showing that in the longer term there are benefits, given that in particular science is very much a cumulative and building activity rather than a single person one-off activity. So I think there's not I don't have a what does a good research culture look like. I certainly I feel that I see the ingredients that will contribute to an improved research culture. But that those are, as I say, interventions on many different levels.
I know your sort of focus is on the UK. Do you have a sense of whether that funding pressure is an international phenomenon, or researchers in other countries facing those sorts of shortfalls. I mean, maybe the solution may not be exactly the same, but I just wonder if you get a sense of that.
I don't think I'm probably qualified on that front. Others might. David might be, for instance.
I think there are many countries where the system is the same, actually, the same in the States. But let's just focus on why that is. It's because universities are not contract research organisations who jump to other people's tunes. They are active partners in the research, and of course the scientists or academics, researchers themselves will want to have a strong say in the direction that research takes. So the reason why ostensibly 80% and in truth closer to 70% of the costs are paid by funders is because there's an expectation that universities will be partners, and if universities don't want to be partners, and there are occasions where it just costs too much, or they don't have the people with the skills required to do the job, then they just say no. Now, they're not good at just saying no, I think, to be honest, but in life generally, if you chase money without considering the cost there is of carrying out what you have to do when you've got the money, then you're in trouble. And I think that is a real challenge, particularly for some of our bigger research universities. In which areas do you focus and perhaps not invest the funds that are being called of you? So the system's designed for this to happen. It's not an artefact, although some ways in which it's implemented may be egregious.
Yeah.
You know, one of the real great things that eLife does is look at research culture, but globally with early career students. It's got ambassadors across many different countries, and we actually work to highlight a number of things that they find problematic in research culture. So we're listening globally to a very wide spectrum, very diverse spectrum of individuals, and we use that sort of knowledge to incorporate what we do as an organisation. We're very lucky in that we get grants from our funders in order to carry out that particular work. So it's I think a lot of the sort of ideas around how to address research culture, you have to actually listen. And at least this gives us a platform in order to understand what the problems are. We've got a features section where we often highlight the problems that are going on within universities, within the culture of how people are academics and what they face. So I think whilst we're not necessarily always providing solutions, I think one of the biggest things is finding out what the problems are, and at least we're making huge attempts to try and do that, and for that to inform where we stand as an organisation and how we progress in terms of what we do and how we move forward.
Are there any headline problems or issues that stand out, or is that? I mean, it's a very broad scope question.
There's so many. I would advise anyone to go and have a look at the features section at eLife. There's viewpoints from neurodiverse audiences that are scientists, that there's looking at it from the viewpoint of women and the scientific setting. There's just so many different voices to listen to, and actually you realise how many problems are there for everyone. And actually there's not many venues that they can voice these things. So I think obviously part of it is listening to that, but then what do you do next? That's the big issue.
I feel for the sake of balance, Stephen, Springer Nature's has got a huge global footprint. Are you engaging with some of these kind of conversations around research culture or?
Yeah, I mean, the thing will publishers and our customers, one of the great things about being a publisher is your customers are also your suppliers, they're also your partners in the quality assurance process, and whether in short term in terms of a transactional peer review or long term as an editor relationship. So goodness knows, I think we probably all spend a lot of our time talking to researchers because that's our business. If we're not, what on earth are we actually, who are we talking to? Just each other. We have a big global footprint. I personally am at the moment spending a lot of time in some of the places where I think we at least need to put a lot of attention, China and India. There, I would say the opportunities for researchers and the pressure they're under seem a little bit less pressure and a little bit more opportunity relative to Europe or North America. But it's relative. Everybody feels that I think it probably is worse in UK and Europe now than it was 20 years ago. But I'm sure if we go back 20 years, people who said, "Oh, I'm under a lot of pressure. There's not enough money." It's just got progressively more difficult as the competition has increased, and you look at the ratio of grant applications that are funded. Mm-hmm. And they're progressively, that slope is a reducing one, and that just says that we're out of balance between demand and supply on that front. It's not going to suddenly change. We need to make sure that the culture and the symptoms of that are addressed, because the resources are still going to be, they're always going to be finite, and there's never going to be, you're never going to be able to do everything that you'd like to do. That's human beings just operate like that.
Yeah. I've got one eye on time. We've got 4 minutes to go, so I need to think about bringing this to a close. For people familiar with the question time format, it is tradition that we have one final question that is a sort of quick fire answer. So Laura Dormer. Laura, can we please get a microphone to Laura? And I'll say to the panellists, I think sort of 30 seconds to a minute each on this one, and then we can bring things to a close. Laura, please.
Thank you. It's a quick question. AI, friend or foe?
Fiona, I'll just go along the table.
From my point of view, friends, just think about the kind of articles of the future. I used to work in review publishing. Think of how review publishing will change. What kind of article comes next? It's actually a really exciting time to be in publishing. I think we should think of it in that way. Sure, there's problems with research integrity, but then there's opportunities too.
David?
I think AI provides wonderful opportunities for all of us. I think, sure, there are also threats for all of us. So it's neither friend nor foe. It's a tool that we can use, and one that, if we use unwisely, will not be incredibly helpful. I think the copyright issue is one of the early things that needs nailed.
Chris?
I think used appropriately and wisely, it has the potential to be a huge friend.
I think with caution. It's certainly powerful. With caution, it can be very positive, but it is not an answer, at least in my mind, in the foreseeable future, that should operate without human direct involvement. Stepping back and letting the machine run things is likely to be the most dangerous thing we could do to ourselves. The humans have to remain tightly working with the AI, and perhaps one day it will move beyond that, but I think we have to learn a lot more before we could get to that point.
Wouldn't it have been fascinating, Dan, to have had a chatbot giving an answer to the questions?
Absolutely. I'm not sure how good a quality the answers would be. After the quiz last night, and I stress this was after, we weren't cheating. We asked we asked ourselves, could ChatGPT have done a better job? And for those of you who participated in the quiz, one of the rounds was a list of anagrams it was only the consonants for various modes of transport. So one of them was CN. What mode of transport is that? It's canoe. And I posed that question to ChatGPT, and the answer it came back with, what mode of transport has only the consonant C in it? It came back with cannon. So I therefore thought, I'm not going to invite the fifth guest to the table. We're out of time. I have to say such a big thank you to the panel. Doing this is a really, really tough gig. because they are coming to this blind. So I really do. Please do show your appreciation for our analysts. And then finally, I'm under instructions. Can we all please stay seated? I believe Jamie is going to come up and just wrap things up. Jamie. By the way, which phone this is.
Is this mic on? Thank you. I should add that there's also been a luggage ticket found as well. So if you've checked your luggage in and you've lost your ticket, go to the ALPS desk and they might be able to help you with that. And before I begin, just also to remind everyone that lunch is available downstairs as of now. So as soon as we're done, and I won't be long, you can go and enjoy some lunch. I wanted to formally close the conference and start by thanking you so much all for attending this conference this time, both here and if you've joined us online. A conference isn't a conference without delegates. It's just a few empty rooms and a few blank screens. So it's been great to have you all here. We've had over 300 people in Manchester for this conference this year, which is significantly up from last year's numbers. So it's been great to see everyone. And it's been amazing to see everyone enjoy their days here and seeing the conversations at the social events or tea breaks and that exchange of ideas. It's been very vibrant. I've really enjoyed that. I do want to do some formal congratulations and thank yous as well before you finish. And first start by congratulating, for a second time, our award winners from last night. So I'll read them out and then maybe we'll have a round of applause. So in no particular order, we had the winner of the ALPS Award for the contribution to scholarly publishing, who was Pippa Smart. We had the ALPS Impact Award 2023, where the winner was IOP Publishing, and highly commended was the original etudes for the developing conductor. And then the ALPS Award for Innovation in Publishing, where we had two winners, BMJ Impact Analytics, and the bilingualism from submission to publication from Midwave and Creadocs. So if you can join me. Thank you. Again, I know I've thanked this group a lot already, but they just deserve more and more thanks. So a very special thank you again to all of our speakers and all of our chairs, to Nicola Nugent and the programme committee. You've done an amazing job. It's been a fantastic programme. It's been great to hear all the diversity of perspectives on all these issues that are really important to us. So thank you to all our speakers, chairs and programme committee. Thank you to our sponsors. I mentioned the sponsors in the welcoming address. We can't really hold the conference without their contributions. So thank you to all our sponsors who are listed here on the screen. So thank you to our sponsors. We couldn't really have done our conference this week without the amazing support of Lee and his team, who've been sitting working tirelessly away on the side here, and all the other staff at the hotel who've made us feel very welcome, have kept us comfortable, fed and watered. So thank you to Lee and his team, and all the hotel staff. And then finally, a very special thank you to a very special team, our very own ALPS team, who have been working so hard, tirelessly, without complaint, over the many months leading up to this event and during the event. I'm sure they're going to just collapse at the weekend and have a really well-deserved rest. So thank you to our ALPS team. Please save the dates for next year's conference, which are on the screen, 11th to the 13th of September. Really looking forward to that and looking forward to seeing you all there. So again, thank you. You've all been brilliant. It's been an amazing conference, so have a safe journey home and a lovely weekend. Thank you.